My name is Orpriel, and I am the VP Product at Hermetic. In the next 20 minutes or so, I will attempt to explain the problem as we see it and how we believe Hermetic can help solve that problem. So, to kick it off, let's take a walk through the history of access control related breaches in the public cloud. Access control has always been an issue, and in the beginning, people were struggling even with the bare basics. For example, 6 years ago, a code hosting provider named Codespaces had to completely shut down its business following a breach. The breach occurred because it failed to secure access to its admin console with MFA. The journalist actually coined this incident as murder in the Amazon cloud. Then, for a few years, the leading cause of AWS data breaches were organizations leaving open access to S3 buckets. This also included sensitive S3 buckets. These buckets were actually left open so anybody could access them. This actually happened to the biggest and the brightest, with the trend culminating around 2017, making that year the year of the open S3 buckets. All the examples in the slide took place in 2017. The Experian one was probably one of the most publicized breaches due to the number of individuals it affected. But the Accenture story is an especially powerful one. The breached Accenture bucket contained sensitive passwords and secret keys of their clients. Basically, these were the keys to the firm's client kingdom. Still today, no one knows how many organizations were breached as a result of the Accenture exposure. So, just like always, the security community reacted to this challenge by introducing products or developing homegrown tools that detect if an S3 bucket is configured to be publicly accessible. Even with that, we still hear every now and then about an organization being compromised this way, but there has been a big improvement over the past few years. However, as Alexander Graham Bell once said, once one door closes, another one opens. In 2018, we experienced a wave of AWS database breaches. Clearly, the constant introduction of additional PaaS capabilities by the cloud service providers, coupled with the speed and agility of the public cloud development, made it harder for organizations to ensure their assets are not publicly accessible. But public access is just one example, and in fact, a very simple case of poor access management. So I'm sure you all heard about the Capital One breach that occurred in 2019. Without going into all the technical details, Capital One deployed an app. In this specific case, it was a web application firewall. The deployment had two inherent issues. One with the security of the application, and the other was with the permission set granted to the application. The first issue was a vulnerability that an attacker could use to compromise this app. In this specific case, it was a server-side request forgery vulnerability. This vulnerability allowed the server to be tricked into running commands that it should never have been permitted to run, including those that allowed it to talk to other services in the environment. The other problem was the unrestricted access this application had to other resources in the Capital One AWS environment. These permissions also included access to a S3 bucket that contained sensitive customer information. From there, the story is obvious. The attacker compromised the application and used the permissions that were granted to that application to traverse the environment, access that S3 bucket, and exfiltrate millions of customer records. Needless to say, this data exfiltration could have been avoided if the permissions were clear to the responsible team. So, according to the latest report by Gartner, 50% of security failures are a direct result of inadequate management of identities, access, and privilege. That number is only going to keep rising and is expected to reach 75% by 2023. And that is the exact reason both Gartner and Forrester have created a new category of products called CIEM and CIG. So why is it so hard to manage permissions in the public cloud? Even with the major cloud providers offering tools to help simplify the process of achieving least privilege, and the cloud providers offering different logging features so an audit trail is available, it is still very complex and borderline impossible to understand across all accounts who has access to what, where the sensitive data resides, and what is actually exposed. The sheer number of permutations available is just too great and has become far too hard to manage, as evidenced by the rise in cloud outages due to customer misconfiguration. Organizations often rely on automation and even manual configuration that is just too susceptible to errors. Even further, there is an increased risk that attackers will exploit these misconfigurations, as evidenced by some of the data breaches I mentioned earlier. Again, to emphasize, the problem has exponentially grown with the shift of many companies from on-prem deployments to cloud deployments. Every organization moving to the public cloud understands that securing identities and governing permissions becomes critical. The access to many resources, such as S3 buckets, is controlled only via identity and access management. And as I mentioned, managing the identities and their entitlements is very complex. Understanding who can access what, mapping the effective permissions of a user, or finding who can access a given resource, such as a database, is a difficult problem. So now that I've talked about the problem and even shared some examples of actual breaches, how can Ermetic help solve this problem? Ermetic has 5 pillars that tackle and address the underlying failures. The first is visibility. Ermetic discovers all entities in the environment across all accounts, providing unmatched visibility and understanding into all the entities and behaviors in your public cloud infrastructure. This can even include access patterns of your federated users. From there, we move to analytics. This is where we take all the data around the entities we discovered and start analyzing it to understand all the different access policies and usage patterns in order to identify all the risks in the environment. From there, we move to policy enforcement. This is where we take those risks and surface them in an easily consumable fashion, allowing anyone to understand the risk and the needed steps to remediate them. To tie all this together, Ermetic offers full automation so it can even do the work for the team and automate the entire process from discovery to actual remediation. The last pillar is focused on the compliance of the environment. This is where the Ermetic solution can take industry standards like SOC and report on any violation from that standard. So let's now take a look at the Ermetic product. Before we start the demo, I would like to say that considering we only have a short amount of time, I won't be able to show everything that the Ermetic platform can do. I will show some of the unique features and functionality that help organizations of all sizes achieve a better security posture in the public cloud. The Ermetic platform is a SaaS solution, so no installation is required by our users. The instantiation of an instance is very simple and takes less than 5 minutes, even if you've never onboarded a product to your cloud environment. For this demo, I will start off with some of the widgets in the product dashboard. The dashboard in general gives us visibility into some of the data gathered by Ermetic and a high-level understanding of the environment security posture. So let me explain a bit more about what we see in front of us now. As you can see, this specific deployment covers 3 AWS accounts. The dashboard and the product are currently representing the data of all 3 accounts together. I can, however, select a single account and have the product only reflect that selected single account. I will mention that if you run a multi-cloud environment, you get the added benefit of having a consolidated view into all the clouds in a single place. So as an example, if your organization has multiple AWS accounts and multiple Azure subscriptions, the Ermetic product would give you a single view into all of them in a single location. Now, let's start taking a look at the widgets. I'll start off with the leftmost widget, the Identity Intelligence widget. This widget gives you visibility into all the identities within your environment. You can see that we have a total of 340 identities. These identities are automatically categorized into the risk level they pose to the environment. You can see, for example, that we have 57 identities categorized into the critical risk level. Even more specific, out of those 57 identities, we have 5 identities that are used by third-party identities. By clicking the Show More button, I can dive down even deeper and move to our Identity Intelligence page. So once we're in the Identity Intelligence page, here we will see a full makeup of all those 340 identities. We right away get additional insight into identities like how many service, federated, and third-party identities you have in the environment. We can see that the majority of the identities in this environment are service identities. We can also filter and see all third-party identities and understand who poses the greatest risk to our environment. The list is sorted by the identities that pose the greatest risk, removing the guesswork out of what should be focused first. The platform automatically adds labels like the admin label or the third-party label, in addition to categorizing each identity based on its entitlements. Now, the visibility provided by the Ermetic platform doesn't end there. If we click one of these identities, we can get even more information. Now that I clicked on the identity, I move into the page about that specific identity. The first tab I see is the Info tab. This will give me some additional data around the entity, like if they have access keys enabled and when they were last used. Now, I'll go into the Permissions tab. This will provide me right away with an access graph that represents all the permissions that this user has. I can view this either as a graph we see or in a table format like this. Jumping back to the access graph, I can see right away that this user has access to many services via several different policies. Ermetic can see the policy regardless of the type, be it an AWS managed policy, a customer managed policy, or an inline policy. The one thing that sticks out right away in this view is that this user doesn't actually use most of the permissions given to it. In addition, this user view also allows us to see the activity log of that user, the risk associated with that user, and historic configuration related to that user. Ermetic does this to all the entities in the environment, not only users. So let's see another example and look at an S3 bucket. You can see all the different S3 buckets I have in the environment and a bit of information around them. Now we will take a look at this specific bucket. As you can see, this bucket has cross-account access, meaning other accounts can access this specific bucket. If we click on the bucket, we can again see all the different tabs. Let's go straight to the Permissions tab so we can see the access graph and all the different methods one can get permissions to access this bucket. Some interesting facts I would like to highlight are that this bucket can also be accessed by some compute resources, like these Lambda functions. This is an important distinction, as it is very important to understand not just user-to-service access, but also service-to-service access. Another interesting fact I would like to show is that we can also show the federated users that have access to this bucket. In this specific instance, we can see the Okta users that have access to this specific bucket. This leads me to a very unique feature within the Ermetic platform. The Ermetic product integration with IDP solutions like Okta. If we navigate in the inventory menu to Okta, we will be able to see all the different federated users and groups that have access to this AWS environment. If we go to the Okta users and select a user, we once again can see that deep visibility that I demonstrated before. Going back to the dashboard, I want to take a look at the excessive permissions widget. This widget gives us an overview of how many excessive permissions exist within the environment and how they're distributed across all the identities. Notice that this environment is 93% excessive. That means that only 7% of the permissions in this environment are least privileged. The remainder are excessive and get categorized based on their excessiveness. For example, we already saw earlier that this environment has a lot of service accounts, and here we can actually see that a lot of these accounts are inactive. Also notice that we have identities that are being used by third parties that are inactive. This is something we tend to see quite often in customer environments. Another aspect I would like to point out is that once again, everything is categorized into severity. So understanding what should be addressed first is a no-brainer. Now, let's dive into the details by clicking the Show More button and navigating to the Analytics Excessive Permissions page. Here we can easily see the inactive identities, overprivileged identities, and overprivileged groups. Again, each section has identities organized from the riskiest identity to the least riskiest identity. This page also allows you to easily remediate the excessive permissions findings associated with any one of these identities. Let's take a look at an example of a finding. This finding is a role with excessive permissions, and we can see that the system has automatically labeled the finding with both the admin label and the public machine label. Without even looking at the details, we can already understand that we are dealing with a service account that has admin privileges in the environment, and that a public virtual machine is connected to this account, effectively granting it full admin rights on the environment. Diving into the findings, we can see the role named EC2 Dorky Admin has a managed policy called Administrator Access attached to it and is linked to two different compute resources. This one policy gives it permissions to 255 services. That is all the services AWS has to offer. We can also see that this role really uses 5 services out of the 255 services it has access to. The details gives us an understanding about this role. As we can see, this role was created 10 months ago, but was last active a few hours ago. We can then see all this data also in the access graph like we saw before. At the bottom of the page, we can see the remediation steps offered by the Ermetic platform. As you can see, the remediation is fairly straightforward with 2 steps. Ermetic is suggesting we create a new managed policy with the permissions based on the role's actual usage data, and the second step would be to detach this role from the current policy it has attached. Clicking on the diff button, we can see a side-by-side view of the current policy and the Ermetic recommended policy. Note that we have given the identity access to only the services it needs. From here, we have a few options. We can either download the new policy and apply it manually with very little effort, or we can have the Ermetic platform auto-remediate this for us by clicking the remediate button. We can also use the Terraform and CloudFormation options if your organization uses one of those. Let's jump back again to the dashboard and have a look at where we stand from a misconfiguration perspective. The misconfiguration widget gives us insight into the type of misconfigurations present in the environment. We can see that most of the misconfigurations are network misconfigurations and that only about 50% of the environment's resources are properly configured. Hitting the Show More button will take us to the Policies page and show us all the different policy checks that have failed in this environment. As you can see, each rule tells us to what standard it belongs to and if the environment passed or failed that specific check. Clicking on the failed rule will take us back to the Findings page and show us the relevant findings. The findings in this case still contain details, but it doesn't have an access graph as it is not relevant to this type of finding. The finding does still contain the Ermetic offered remediation steps with a full step-by-step guide of how to resolve the specific risk. Jumping back to the dashboard, we can see a few other useful widgets. The first is the Internet Exposed Resources. That shows us all the resources we have that are publicly exposed to the Internet. Then the Findings widget that summarizes the findings discovered by the Ermetic platform. From there, we can see the top accounts at risk, so we can easily focus on the accounts that have the most findings or are the most critical to our organization. The next widget is the Top Finding Types widget. This widget gives us a view of the top finding types prioritized by the risk and number of resources with findings. The last widget is the If You Only Have 5 Minutes widget. This widget basically tells you what findings in your environment are the riskiest and will give you the biggest bang for your buck if you resolve them. Now, I could probably spend another hour at least showing you other features and functionality of the Ermetic platform, but unfortunately, this is all the time they gave me. I do want to thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this brief introduction of the Ermetic platform. Thank you.